Welcome to Fire and Water, Coming of Age in this Age with Quanita Robertson and Tenneson Wool, cultivating wise leaders one show at a time. So, one of the reasons that I wanted to do grief as our first show is I just believe that there has to be a letting go of old stuff so that new stuff could come in. And so for me, in starting the podcast, I think it's important that we let go of some of the old stuff, and a conversation around grief, I think, is just a perfect place to start.
Yeah, if I pick that up, Quanita, I can feel that also. You and I have had conversations on grief, and we each have our lived experiences also, and we're with people in their lived experiences. So, yeah, I can feel there's an essential honesty or something about coming into our relationship, who we are as human beings in relationship to grief, that feels like, fingers crossed, it might just clear the way both internally and externally for some needed progress or deepening or getting to the heart of it or something like that.
What do you think are some gifts or lessons learned about or from grief?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with a couple of images because these were the things that sort of arrived as I've been thinking, and I just want to start with images. Start with the first one here. There's a book that you loaned me by Francis Weller around grief, The Wildness of Sorrow, I think it's called. And I've been looking through that book a little bit with a little trepidation, like, ooh, I really want to read this, and I'm kind of a little nervous to read it too. And that is some of me in relationship to grief, and a little avoidance of it also. But one of the things that caught my attention, and as I sat with it earlier today, was around the wildness piece of it. And thinking of sorrow as a wild creature, or thinking of grief as a wild creature, the image that comes to me with that was of like a wild wolf, like almost, sitting out in the in the image that I had, it was sitting out in a little bit of a prairie and having this wolf come up to me, and not in an attacking way, but just coming. And I have a bit of an affiliation with wolves, in part because of my last name. But there's something about them as creatures, as animals, that really has drawn my attention. The wildness of the animal, and I'm kind of staring into the wolf's eyes. It's not a confrontation in the image that I'm thinking. It's just there, but I'm aware that there's wildness in the creature, and that this creature is also majestic. It's like it's coming and laying down in the grass near me, or it's close by. Something in that image feels compelling to me, with Francis Weller's description there around the wildness, and helps me. It sort of moves me as I think about grief. And though I'm speaking personally, I'm thinking it out loud as applying to more than just the personal here. This is many people, and in many contexts, or even group contexts. How we be in our grief or in our sorrow, as if we would be in relationship to a wild creature, the wolf in my image, feels helpful, something to watch and be really thoughtful about. And there's something actually really beautiful about it. The second image that I offer into this, that came to me just a few moments ago, was I'm thinking of my garden, and the way that grief needs to be tended, like it's not a one-time check thing. Needs to be tended. And I'm thinking of my gardens, and how, for me, when I travel, sometimes by the time I get back from travels in the spring/summertime, the garden is like gone crazy with growth or weeds or tall things that are in there that I don't necessarily want. The untending of a garden
Mm.
has me thinking about the untending of grief. When I tend my garden, as in, oh, here's 5 minutes between phone calls, I think I'll just go out and pull a few little tiny weeds. It's nothing. And it's fun to do. When I don't tend it and now need to jump into a major pull out these massive tall weeds, it's a much bigger effort. It points me towards something around the process that is being in relationship or tending to grief and sorrow, not just the eventness of that. Let me pause. What does that stir in you?
The first thing that the untending makes me think about is Martine Prechtel saying that the piece about, as Americans, we don't know how to grieve because we think we can grieve alone, and grief requires community.
Mm.
Because he says, we'll never go to the depths of our grief because we're all afraid we'll drown in it. And so we kind of go in the grief a little bit, but we don't always go to the bottom, which means we kind of stay in the same pool instead of coming out the other side and then going into another one. So it makes me think of that tending to that we as a culture don't do very well in tending to grief. And the other piece that he says that I love, that I just for years have kind of sat with this whole idea of grief isn't about sadness, it's
Mm-hmm.
about release.
Mm-hmm.
And he says when you're grieving the thing that you've lost, we call it grief, but when you're grieving the thing that you got, we call it praise. And he said, because to really know how to praise something, you need to know what would be lost if it was gone. And just that whole concept of, what if I thought about grief also in the terms of just release?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that open up for me? And how I hold it, how I view it, how I dance with it.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that came up for me around this piece of grief is I believe that one of the biggest lies that we tell in this culture around grief is that we all grieve differently.
Mm.
And I don't think that's true. I think we all avoid grief differently.
Mm.
And I think the story that we all grieve differently gives us permission to avoid it.
Mm.
But the grief is just feeling of the sadness and the pain and the release, whatever that release might be. And we tend to hold back on that and use all different ways to justify the holding back. But that feeling of our emotions is just the same for everybody.
Mm.
I have had the privilege, opportunity to walk with lots of people through grief.
Mm.
And what I found for myself, and it took me a long time to realize this, is that I used to think that grief automatically came with suffering. I thought you couldn't have you couldn't have grief without suffering. But what I've learned is that that's not necessarily the case, that the suffering is the resistance to grief. It's not grief itself. That when I'm not in resistance and I just let it go through me, it's sad, but it's not suffering. I don't always know how to do that. But this whole idea that I just always thought that they came together.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the things that kind of pop up for me when I'm initially thinking about grief.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the learning for me. I think in needing to snoop around a little bit more with some of the difference, say, between sadness and grief. I'm a person who can relate to feeling a lot of sadness, but I can relate to, oh boy, lots of sadness. And yet grief seems something related, but more than that. For me, it's been an awareness to realize that just the sadness is not enough. Like there's an active process or an active something around grieving that I don't fully understand either. This is where I find myself reaching out to friends or reaching out to others so as to be held perhaps in the release of the sadness. You've often said something like people are afraid they're going to drown. And it occurs to me that when the sadness is so strong in the first place, and in an attempt to grieve, we're leaning into more of that sadness. Of course, there's going to be fear that it'll be too much. So your words about needing community or needing friends or needing process for that matter, held by others or with others to support some of the essential grieving that we need feels really important. And I'm thinking, it's easy to find it individually, but
Mhm.
as easy as it is to find it individually, I also think there's just incredible layers of shared grief or group grief that exists, even if it's not consciously thought about or even consciously aware of. It's like, if there's a forest fire nearby and there's smoke in the air, you may not think about it, but you're still living in that smoke. And it seems to me that grief can be that way also. The grief of the planet, the grief of confrontation, the grief of conflict, the general contexts of these things. We're living in them as groups also.
I think so much of what we experience now culturally as rage and as anger and frustration is just unfelt grief. It's like it's easier in our culture to do the other things than to really just sit in the sadness and grieve and let it flow through us.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's difference, Quanita, in a masculine relationship with grief and a feminine relationship with grief?
I think there's difference in the way that maybe our culture allows us to have access to it.
Yeah.
I think that in our culture, women are more allowed to be in the grief and to be in their feelings in general, not just grief.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kind of. I said that, now I want to kind of go back because I think that not necessarily our feelings in general, in certain places. I think we're more allowed to be in the grief than we allow men to be in the grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think men hear a lot more of the, man up, or, it's okay, brush it off, that kind of stuff, than women do.
Yeah.
And I even think that in our culture, we use being emotional as being feminine as a way to put someone down too, that don't be a sissy kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder though, like, what are the spaces that are needed to give us more access to grief?
It just, the thing that it raises for me, connects for me, is a lot of my learning lately through a couple of good teachers, let's just say for now. They're really encouraging a simple process that is awareness. Like even just becoming aware in a like non-judgmental way, just become aware of what is the thinking or feeling that's going on. When you ask that question about, what are the places that we need, that's an immediate place that I'm feeling fruitful these days, which I'm trying to find a little bit of what's behind it. I'm thinking it out loud together here. Mm-hmm. It's like even just the permission is a bit of a loaded word, but just the permission to feel what is already there and real. And even if it's just a momentary legitimizing, and let's call it grief now, but even a momentary legitimizing of that can have significant impact. So, maybe that doesn't speak so much to your question, but it speaks to some relevant dynamic in that or practice or cultural way of being that is maybe largely denied in Western civilization or Western societies, let's say, to just actually feel it. Let me try to pull that down to an example also, because recently was with some people, and in hosting a group, and one of the participants had shared openly about some of his own struggles with depression or his own struggles with despair. And when I listened to that person in the context of many people speaking and sharing some stories, I know I felt it personally, and perhaps in the group also, that there's just a relief that shows up for any of us who are trying to hide those things, even without knowing it, just like avoiding them. I experience a relief in the permission to acknowledge, even for the moment, that's true for me too, or that's like what's happening for me too. So when you say spaces, if I try to connect that back a little bit, it's like when we have containers, you and I use circle so often to hold a deeper space with one another, with the people that we're with. When there is a container, i.e. a circle, in which those kinds of things can be spoken into the middle, and we get a kind of, without needing to fix anything, just a real authentic witnessing, or a more authentic witnessing with each other, that alone seems to help to poke into a little bit more of the relationship, or the masked relationship, with grief and sorrow and other cousins related to that.
Thank you for joining Fire and Water with Quanita Robertson and Tenneson Wolf.